April 16th, 1960, a beautiful spring evening in McAllen, Texas. 25-year-old Irene Garza, a former beauty queen and beloved schoolteacher, kisses her parents goodbye and heads to Sacred Heart Catholic Church for Holy Saturday confession. She's wearing her best dress and carrying her small purse. It's the last time her family will ever see her alive. 5 days later, a canal worker makes a discovery that will haunt a community and expose one of the most shocking cover-ups in American religious history. What he finds floating in that murky water will reveal a truth so disturbing that it will take 57 years for justice to finally be served. This is the story of Irene Garza, a young woman whose faith led her into the presence of evil and whose family refused to let her case die, even when the most powerful institution in their community tried to bury the truth forever. A trusted priest, a missing confession, and a conspiracy of silence that lasted more than half a century. What really happened inside Sacred Heart Church that April evening? If you're new here, this channel covers cases where justice was denied for far too long. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because this story will show you how far some will go to protect their own. Irene Garza was everything a small Texas community could be proud of. At 25, she embodied grace, intelligence, and devotion in a way that made her beloved throughout McAllen. Former Miss South Texas, she could have pursued a glamorous life, but instead chose to dedicate herself to teaching elementary school children and living a quiet, faithful existence with her parents. Those who knew Irene described her as gentle and soft-spoken, someone who found joy in simple things. She attended Sacred Heart Catholic Church regularly, never missing Sunday Mass or important holy days. Her faith wasn't just routine, it was the cornerstone of her life, guiding every decision she made. McAllen in 1960 was a close-knit border town where everyone knew their neighbors, and the Catholic Church stood at the center of community life. Sacred Heart Church wasn't just a place of worship, it was where families celebrated their most important moments, where children received their first communion, where the community gathered in times of joy and sorrow. The church commanded deep respect and unquestioning trust. When priests spoke, people listened. When they asked for discretion, people obliged. The idea that something sinister could happen within those sacred walls was simply unthinkable to the faithful residents of McAllen. April 16, 1960, fell on Holy Saturday, one of the most important days in the Catholic calendar. It was a time for confession, for spiritual preparation before Easter Sunday. For someone like Irene, missing this sacred observance would have been impossible. As evening approached, she prepared carefully for her visit to Sacred Heart, unaware that her simple act of faith would lead her into a nightmare that would consume her family for generations. April 16, 1960. The sun was setting over McAllen as Irene Garza made her final preparations for Holy Saturday confession. She chose her outfit carefully, a modest dress appropriate for church, her small purse containing her prayer book and rosary. At exactly 7 o'clock, she kissed her parents goodbye and walked to her car, promising to return within the hour. Sacred Heart Catholic Church stood quiet in the evening light, its familiar silhouette a comforting presence in the neighborhood where Irene had grown up. She parked near the church entrance, gathered her belongings, and walked through the heavy wooden door she had passed through countless times before. Inside, the church was dimly lit, filled with the peaceful atmosphere that preceded Easter Sunday. Other parishioners moved quietly through the pews, preparing for their own confessions. Irene made her way toward the confessional area, where Father John Fight, a visiting priest from a nearby monastery, was hearing confessions. Father Fight was 27 years old, just 2 years older than Irene. He had arrived at Sacred Heart recently, brought in to help with the busy Easter schedule. To the congregation, he appeared to be exactly what a priest should be, young, devoted, committed to his calling. What happened next would remain hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of institutional protection and deliberate silence. But the evidence suggests that when Irene entered that confessional, she encountered something that had nothing to do with faith or redemption. Hours passed. Irene's parents waited at home, expecting her return. 7:30 came and went. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. By 10, Worry had transformed into panic. Irene was never late. She was never careless about letting her family know where she was. Her father drove to Sacred Heart Church, hoping to find her car still in the parking lot, hoping there was some innocent explanation. The car was there, parked exactly where she had left it, but Irene was nowhere to be found. The church was locked. The evening confession services had ended hours earlier. The next morning brought no relief. Irene's bed remained untouched. Her teaching position at the elementary school was left unfilled when she failed to appear. The community that had known and loved her for 25 years suddenly found itself facing an impossible reality. Irene Garza had vanished. The search began immediately. Neighbors, friends, church members, and law enforcement spread across McAllen and the surrounding countryside. They checked every building, every field, every place where a young woman might have gone or been taken. The local newspaper printed her photograph. Radio stations broadcast descriptions, but the search also revealed disturbing details. Irene's purse was found, discarded near a canal outside town. A single shoe, clearly hers, was discovered along a roadside. Most haunting of all, her delicate lace veil, the one she had worn to church that evening, was found torn and dirty, abandoned in the brush. These weren't the belongings of someone who had left voluntarily. These were the scattered remnants of something terrible, a trail of evidence that led toward a truth no one wanted to confront. Father John Fite, meanwhile, remained conspicuously quiet about his encounter with Irene. When questioned, his responses were vague, inconsistent. He claimed to remember very little about the young woman who had been the last person to seek his spiritual guidance that evening. 5 days after Irene disappeared, a canal worker making his routine rounds noticed something floating in the murky water that shouldn't have been there. What he found brought the worst fears of an entire community crashing into reality. Irene Garza was pulled from the irrigation canal on April 21st, her body bearing the unmistakable signs of violence. She had been beaten, assaulted, and suffocated. The gentle schoolteacher who had entered Sacred Heart Church seeking spiritual solace had instead encountered unspeakable brutality. The autopsy revealed the full extent of what had been done to her. Head trauma, evidence of sexual assault, signs that she had been restrained, that she had fought for her life. This wasn't a random crime or a tragic accident. This was deliberate, calculated violence against an innocent woman. But even as the evidence mounted, even as the community reeled from the horror of what had happened to one of their own, a different kind of crime was already beginning. The systematic cover-up that would deny Irene justice for more than half a century. Do you think the church knew more than they were letting on? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you want justice for Irene. The investigation into Irene Garza's case began with what should have been the most obvious lead in criminal history. Father John Fite was the last person to see her alive, yet from the very beginning, law enforcement seemed reluctant to treat him as anything more than a helpful witness. When detectives first questioned Fite, his story was riddled with inconsistencies. He claimed to remember very little about his encounter with Irene, despite her being a striking young woman who would have been memorable to anyone. His timeline for that evening kept shifting. Details that should have been crystal clear to someone telling the truth became murky and evasive under questioning. But perhaps most damning of all, investigators noticed something that should have raised immediate red flags. Father Fite had fresh scratches on his hands and arms. When asked about them, he provided explanations that seemed rehearsed and unconvincing. These weren't old wounds or accidental marks. These were the kind of defensive injuries that appear when someone fights back against their attacker. The investigation took an even more disturbing turn when detectives discovered that Father Fite was already under suspicion for another crime. Just weeks before Irene's disappearance, he had been accused of attacking Maria Guerra, a young woman who had gone to confession at a nearby church. Maria had survived her encounter, but her description of what happened was chilling. According to Maria, Fite had restrained her during confession, attempted to assault her, and only stopped when she managed to fight him off and escape. The attack bore striking similarities to what investigators believed had happened to Irene, a young woman seeking spiritual guidance, a priest who abused his position of trust, violence disguised as religious ritual. Despite having 2 victims, despite physical evidence, Despite a clear pattern of behavior, the investigation began to stall in ways that defied explanation. Witnesses who had been eager to help suddenly became reluctant to talk. Evidence that should have been processed quickly seemed to disappear into bureaucratic delays. The reason for this sudden lack of progress became clear when investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a criminal case. They were confronting the institutional power of the Catholic Church, and that institution was closing ranks to protect one of its own. Church officials began making calls to law enforcement, to prosecutors, to anyone with influence over the case. The message was consistent. Father Fite was a man of God who could never be capable of such acts. The accusations against him were obviously false, the result of anti-Catholic prejudice or misunderstanding. More troubling still, witnesses began reporting pressure from church representatives to modify their statements or remain silent about what they had seen. People who had been willing to testify about Fite's suspicious behavior that evening suddenly developed memory problems or became unavailable for questioning. The cover-up extended beyond mere influence peddling. Church officials began actively working to undermine the investigation. They questioned the character of the victims, suggested alternative theories for what had happened, and used their considerable social and political influence to redirect attention away from their priest. Meanwhile, Father Fite himself was quietly transferred away from Sacred Heart Church. The official explanation was that his assignment had always been temporary, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Just as the investigation was intensifying, the primary suspect was moved beyond easy reach of local law enforcement. The transfer wasn't to another parish in Texas, where investigators could easily follow up. Fite was sent to a monastery in another state, effectively placing him under the protection of church hierarchy, who had no obligation to cooperate with secular authorities. As weeks turned into months, the case against Father Fite began to crumble, not because of lack of evidence, but because of lack of institutional will to pursue that evidence. Prosecutors, who had initially seemed committed to justice, began expressing doubts about their ability to secure a conviction. The Garza family watched in horror as what should have been a straightforward murder case dissolved into bureaucratic inaction. They had lost their daughter to violence, and now they were losing their chance for justice to institutional protection of her killer. Local law enforcement, caught between their duty to solve the case and pressure from powerful religious and political figures, found themselves increasingly isolated. Officers who wanted to pursue the investigation were reassigned or discouraged. Evidence that could have been crucial was allowed to deteriorate or disappear. By the end of 1960, less than a year after Irene's body was found, the investigation had effectively ended. No arrests had been made, no charges had been filed. The case was quietly shelved, filed away with other unsolved crimes that the system had failed to address. But the Garza family refused to accept this outcome. They knew who had taken their daughter's life, and they knew that person was walking free because institutions they had trusted had chosen to protect a predator rather than seek justice for his victim. So far, the church had succeeded in protecting Father Fite. The investigation had been abandoned, and Irene's killer was living safely beyond the reach of Texas law. But somewhere in the shadows, witnesses to the truth were waiting, and their silence wouldn't last forever. The question that haunted McAllen was simple. How many other victims would there be before someone finally found the courage to speak? For 42 years, the truth about what happened to Irene Garza remained buried beneath layers of institutional silence and deliberate cover-up. Father John Fite had disappeared into the protective embrace of the Catholic Church, living quietly in different states, his past carefully hidden from those around him. The Garza family had grown older, but their pain had never diminished, their questions never answered. Then, in 2002, everything changed. Two Catholic priests, their consciences finally overcoming decades of enforced silence, came forward with information that would shatter the Church's carefully constructed narrative. What they revealed was more damning than even the Garza family had imagined. According to these whistleblowing priests, John Fite had confessed, not to police, not to prosecutors, not to any secular authority that could have brought him to justice. He had confessed to other members of the clergy, admitting in detail what he had done to Irene Garza, that April evening in 1960. The confession, as described by the priests, was comprehensive and chilling. Fait had allegedly admitted to attacking Irene during what she believed was a sacred confession. When she resisted, he had panicked, restraining her and eventually ending her life. Afterward, he had transported her body to the canal, where it was later discovered. But perhaps most shocking of all was what the priests revealed about the church's response to this confession. Rather than encouraging Fait to surrender to authorities or seeking justice for Irene, church officials had allegedly helped orchestrate the cover-up that followed. They had knowingly protected a confessed individual and allowed him to continue serving in positions where he could potentially harm others. The revelation explained so much about the investigation's mysterious collapse decades earlier. The pressure on witnesses, the transfer of Fait, the sudden lack of cooperation from church officials. It had all been part of a coordinated effort to shield a confessed criminal from consequences. The priest's decision to come forward after so many years wasn't without cost. They faced potential excommunication, social ostracism, and legal challenges from the institution they had served their entire lives. But they had reached a point where remaining silent had become impossible. Their testimony also revealed that Fait's case wasn't isolated. The church had allegedly used similar tactics to protect other clergy members accused of serious crimes, moving them between parishes, suppressing evidence, and using their institutional power to avoid accountability. As news of the priest's revelation spread, other pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. People who had been afraid to speak in 1960 found their voices decades later. Witnesses who had been pressured into silence began sharing what they had really seen that evening at Sacred Heart Church. The evidence that emerged painted a picture of systematic deception that extended far beyond a single crime. The church hierarchy had allegedly known about Fait's history of violence against women, had been aware of the attack on Maria Guerra, and had chosen to protect him anyway. Even more disturbing was the realization that Fait had continued serving as a priest. For years after confessing to taking Irene's life, he had conducted masses, heard confessions, counseled parishioners, and maintained positions of trust and authority, all while church officials allegedly knew exactly what he was capable of. The breakthrough brought renewed hope to the Garza family, but it also brought fresh pain. Learning that the truth had been known for decades, that justice could have been served years earlier, if not for institutional protection, was almost as devastating as the original crime. Public outrage began building as the story spread beyond McAllen. The idea that a religious institution would protect a confessed individual while denying justice to a victim's family struck at the heart of everything people believed about moral authority and institutional responsibility. But Fait was still alive, still free, and still protected by decades of carefully constructed silence. The question now was whether the legal system would finally have the courage to confront not just an individual criminal, but the institution that had shielded him for so long. The priests had opened the door to justice, but walking through it would require confronting some of the most powerful forces in American society. The revelation from the two priests in 2002 had cracked open a case that seemed permanently closed, but bringing John Fait to justice would still require 14 more years of relentless pressure from the Garza family and a legal system finally willing to confront institutional power. By 2016, John Fait was 83 years old, living quietly in Arizona, still believing that the church's protection had placed him permanently beyond the reach of Texas law. He was wrong. The arrest came swiftly and without warning. Decades after he had walked free from McAllen, Fait found himself in handcuffs, facing extradition to Texas to answer for what he had done to Irene Garza 56 years earlier. The man who had hidden behind clerical robes and institutional power was finally being held accountable. The trial that followed in 2017 was unlike anything McAllen had ever seen. The courtroom was packed with family members, community supporters, and media from across the country. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about whether justice could prevail, even when the most powerful institutions tried to prevent it. The prosecution's case was devastating. The two priests testified about Fait's detailed confession, describing how he had admitted to attacking Irene and disposing of her body. Forensic experts presented evidence that had been ignored for decades. A slide viewer that belonged to Fight had been found near the canal where Irene's body was discovered, linking him directly to the crime scene. Most damaging of all was the testimony about Maria Guerra's assault, the pattern of behavior, the abuse of religious authority, the violence against vulnerable women seeking spiritual guidance. It painted a picture of a predator who had used his position to harm those who trusted him most. Fight's defense attempted to argue that the evidence was too old, that memories had faded, that the case should have been resolved decades earlier. But their arguments only highlighted the very institutional cover-up that had made this delayed justice necessary. The jury deliberated for just hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of the first-degree offense that had taken Irene Garza's life, the courtroom erupted in emotion as family members who had waited 57 years finally heard the word they had longed for: justice. John Feet was sentenced to life in prison, though at his advanced age, everyone understood this was likely a death sentence. The man who had stolen Irene's future would spend his final years behind bars, stripped of the freedom and respect he had enjoyed while his victim's family suffered. But the victory was bittersweet. Fight died in prison in 2020, just 3 years after his conviction. He had lived 87 years, most of them free, while Irene had been denied the chance to see her 26th birthday. The case had finally been resolved, but the broader questions it raised about institutional accountability remained largely unanswered. The Catholic Church never fully acknowledged its role in protecting Fight or apologized for the decades of suffering its actions had caused the Garza family. In the quiet streets of McAllen, Texas, there stands a memorial to Irene Garza, a reminder of a young woman whose faith led her into darkness, but whose family's love ultimately brought light to the truth. Sacred Heart Catholic Church still holds services, but the trust that once seemed unshakable has been forever changed by the knowledge of what happened within those walls in 1960. 57 years. That's how long it took for justice to find John Feet, how long a family had to wait for the truth to be acknowledged, how long a community lived with the knowledge that evil had walked among them, wearing the robes of righteousness. Some say justice was finally served when Fight died behind bars. Others argue that true justice would have meant accountability for those who protected him, consequences for the institution that chose silence over truth. Irene Garza was 25 when her life was stolen from her. She would be 88 today, perhaps surrounded by children and grandchildren, perhaps still teaching, perhaps still attending church with the same faith that led her to Sacred Heart that April evening. Instead, she remains forever young in the memories of those who loved her, forever a symbol of innocence destroyed by those who should have protected it. The Garza family's fight changed how we think about institutional cover-ups, about the courage it takes to speak truth to power, about the price of silence when evil hides behind authority. Their refusal to accept injustice saved other families from wondering, other victims from being forgotten. But the most important lesson of Irene's story isn't about institutions or investigations. It's about a young woman who deserved to live, to love, to grow old, surrounded by those who cherished her. Her memory demands we never forget the human cost of protecting predators. If this case opened your eyes to how justice can be denied, subscribe for more stories that refuse to stay buried. Check out our investigation into another case where powerful institutions tried to silence the truth. And remember that every victim deserves someone willing to fight for them, no matter how long it takes. What do you think should happen to institutions that cover up crimes? Share your thoughts below.